BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello, Nedheads. Hello, Black Box Battalion. Today is Wednesday, another Ripper Wednesday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? On Wednesdays, I talk to you guys about Jack the Ripper, perhaps the world's most famous unsolved mystery. And in this episode, I will be revisiting the Jack the Ripper suspect, James Maybrick, responding to the Ripper cast, and looking at the book, The Poisoner's Handbook by Deborah Blum, which will shed some light on the suspicious death of James Maybrick in 1889. And you guys know the drill. You can hit the like button if you want, subscribe if you haven't, and drop a comment down below if you have something to say about Jack the Ripper. For larger things, you can send them to me at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. And I am your host, Blackbox Ned. Ripper Wednesday is a segment that I started over 2 years ago. It's been just over 2 years now, and one of the first episodes that I did on Ripper Wednesday was about the Jack the Ripper suspect, James Maybrick, as well as the suspicious circumstances surrounding his death, which was known as the egg birth poisoning, and for some reason I had committed it in my memory as the Ike's birth poisoning, so excuse me if I had mispronounced it and misstated it on some previous episodes of Ripper Wednesday, and if I slip up once or twice during this episode, I will apologize in advance. But yes, he died as a result of a case called the Ike birth poisoning, and James Maybrick is one of the most famous and most widely discussed Jack the Ripper suspects, but he's also one that comes onto the scene for a very odd set of reasons. And one of the reasons why I wanted to do a follow-up and updated episode was about 2 weeks ago on Ripper Wednesday, I did an episode called Jack the Ripper Suspect Michael Maybrick, discussing the book They All Love Jack by Bruce Robinson, and of course that naturally got me thinking about James Maybrick, who was his brother. Both James Maybrick and Michael Maybrick are Jack the Ripper suspects, but James Maybrick is a very different type of Ripper suspect because it's possible that the biggest pieces of evidence in relation to his candidacy are absolute fabrications and hoaxes. And the first one is that a diary was discovered, or let's not even say discovered. A diary was brought forward in the 1990s by a man named Michael Barrett, who claimed that he had found the diary of Jack the Ripper. And there's so many different stories about how he had obtained this. And it tells the story of a man named James Maybrick, who went on to become Jack the Ripper, and it's ultimately signed as Jack the Ripper. And there's also a watch that has the name Jack, then Maybrick, and the initials of the victims that will be found on that. But that also might be a complete fabrication. And one of the reasons why I think I did the Ripper Wednesday about James Maybrick so early on was, very simply, this is a story that is easily accessible to people, but I've also found that with the stories that I talk about here on Black Box Online Radio, whether it's the Zodiac Killer, Jack the Ripper, or D.B. Cooper, it's not just about who was the killer, or in the Cooper case, who was the perpetrator. It's also about the stories that are connected to this high-profile unsolved mystery, because there really are two questions that are going to be explored in this episode. Number one, was James Maybrick Jack the Ripper? And number two, was he murdered in 1889 by his wife Florence in the egg birth poisoning? And I think that firstly, this does provide an explanation as to why the Jack the Ripper murders would have stopped, why certain parts of the Whitechapel murders would have stopped, because the Whitechapel murders, of course, go on to 1891 with the murder of Francis Coles, and if you think that Francis Coles was killed by the Ripper, then James Maybrick is not your man. But let's look at some of the basic info about him. He was born on October 24th of 1838, and he passed away on May 11th of 1889. And if he was born on October 24th of 1838, then he would have been 49 years old at the time of the Autumn of Terror, and he would have had his birthday in the middle of it. So ultimately we're dealing with a 50-year-old Jack the Ripper. His brother Michael would have been 3 years younger, 47 at the time of the Autumn of Terror. And this is something that doesn't surprise me anymore. There might be people out there who would just immediately reject a 50-year-old suspect, but there are so many Jack the Ripper suspects that are in their late 40s and early 50s that it doesn't even faze me now. So I wouldn't even strike somebody off for that. I mean, it's just something that's going to come up very frequently. An interesting thing about James Maybrick is that it appears that his primary residence was in Liverpool, not in London, but he had lived in London previously, and he was a cotton merchant, actually. He had also lived in the United States of America, and there he met his wife, Florence, and Florence Maybrick was an American who moved to England, and then this is part of the theory involving James Maybrick that I think is very hard to digest, and it is that he is having some type of extreme marital difficulty with Florence, and he would have become Jack the Ripper as a way to act out the fantasy of killing her over and over again. Because if he murdered her once, then he wouldn't be able to do it again. It would be game over. But if she were still alive, then he could contemplate murdering her but take out his frustrations on other women. So the murders of Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Liz Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Kelly were all done as a way for him to just act out this anger and frustration and possibly hatred of his wife toward other women. And you guys might want to challenge me on this. You might think that this is a far-out statement on my part, but I think the absolute strongest piece of evidence in favor of James Maybrick being Jack the Ripper is not the diary or the pocket watch. Instead, it's that when Mary Kelly's body was found, there were two letters that were written on the wall, F and M. And could he have committed the most horrific murder of all time and then signed it F and M for Florence Maybrick? And I remember a different YouTuber was talking about that, and they were saying, well, this could have been photoshopped, or there is this suspicion that the diary of Jack the Ripper was fabricated. Maybe this was also altered at some point in the 90s. We wouldn't be dealing with Photoshop then, but altering photos could definitely take place. But no, it does appear that that actually was authentic, or at the very least, that was something that was present well before the 90s, well before the Diary of Jack the Ripper. And in earlier photographs of the crime scene, there is indeed the F and M that is on the wall for Florence Maybrick. And I would actually like to go over to the Jack the Ripper Tour article on James Maybrick. And this is one that I was really surprised to read from Jack the Ripper Tour because of some of the comments that were made. And normally the articles on Jack the Ripper Tour are very skeptical, but this one actually seems like it is speaking very highly of James Maybrick as a Jack the Ripper suspect. Many Jack the Ripper suspects have been discussed over the years. Some are highly plausible, some less so, but with the identity of the Ripper still a mystery, will we ever succeed in pinpointing the man behind the mask beyond all doubt? Well, that's a big question to answer. Of course, I'm still somewhat hopeful, and I think, though, that firstly, I might be able to find a suspect in my lifetime where I could say, yeah, okay, 99%, I think that person was Jack the Ripper. That doesn't mean that everybody would agree with me. I might be convinced. You might actually also find a suspect that you are completely convinced was Jack the Ripper. That doesn't mean we'd be able to certify the results for everyone to see, but we can conduct these types of discussions and investigations. And to continue, James Maybrick is one of the most plausible Ripper suspects due to several pieces of key evidence which came to light after his death. Could James Maybrick have been Jack the Ripper? And I'm very surprised that they would present it this way because, as I said, normally the Jack the Ripper Tour articles are skeptical, and then they're going to call James Maybrick a plausible suspect. Who was James Maybrick? He was born in Liverpool in 1838. As I said, he would have been 50 years old at the time. He worked in the cotton trade business, as well as in both London and Liverpool. During the course of his work, he frequently traveled to and from the U.S. In 1871, he moved to Virginia before contracting malaria in 1874. As a result, he became addicted to the medication that was used to treat the disease, and that medication contained arsenic. That will be very important later on, as you can see from the title of this episode, James Maybrick then returned to Liverpool once again, marrying a young woman named Florence Chandler. The marriage bore 2 children, but it was an unhappy one, with both turning to infidelity. Maybrick had multiple mistresses, while his wife enjoyed an affair with a cotton broker called Alfred Brearley. What happened to James Maybrick? In April of 1889, James Maybrick became ill again, eventually passing away in May of that year. His wife Florence was accused of poisoning him with arsenic and was sentenced to life imprisonment for the supposed murder. And as I understand, she was actually sentenced to death by hanging, but then that sentence was commuted to life in prison, and she was ultimately released in 1904 after serving 15 years in prison, and then Florence Maybrick would return to the United States, and she would ultimately live until World War II, and she passed away in the middle of the war in the early 1940s, so she lived for a very long time after she was released from prison. Although it was plausible that James Maybrick had died under suspicious circumstances, the decision that Florence was responsible and her subsequent trial and imprisonment were later thrown into question. This resulted in a re-examination of the case and the evidence, which led to her eventual release in 1904. So as far as that, I really want to put that one on hold for now because I want to talk about the points they have in favor of James Maybrick being Jack the Ripper, and then we can come back to Florence Maybrick and the Egbert poisoning. The evidence in favor of James Maybrick being Jack the Ripper. Over a century after his death, 2 pieces of evidence came to light which purportedly point to James Maybrick and Jack the Ripper being one and the same. The first was a diary, supposedly written by Maybrick's own hand. The traditional Victorian scrapbook diary was discovered battered and ripped, with many pages missing and just a handful remaining. These pages outline the Ripper murders in detail, pointing towards James Maybrick's involvement in the case. Additionally, although many of the details mentioned in the diary would have been widely known by the general public at the time, there were also references to specifics which were not known by anyone except the police and the killer. Lastly, although the author of the diary did not explicitly name the murderer, there are several references to Sir Jim throughout the pages, and this is reportedly the nickname James Maybrick gave himself whilst in the U.S. Okay, James, Jim, I follow you there. That's referring to the name of someone's legal name, but the diary is signed Jack the Ripper. Though less convincing than the diary, the second piece of evidence is a Victorian pocket watch, discovered not long after the diary was found and brought to light. The pocket watch was purportedly belonged to James Maybrick, and the back casing says, "I am Jack J. Maybrick," along with the initials of the canonical 5 victims. However, the authenticity of the pocket watch has been thrown into question over years. Experts are divided as to whether or not the watch is genuinely Victorian. Could it simply have been a clever fake made to look older than it is, using modern technology and aging techniques? And this is ultimately where we're going to get to a standstill because, as I said, what some people think would be the biggest pieces of evidence in favor of James Maybrick being Jack the Ripper do not impress me at all. And the reason why is, it's not so much that Michael Barrett came forward with this diary, it's that the story changed so many times. In one variant of the story, it was found. In the second variant, it's that he obtained it from somebody whom he knew from the pub, and they provided it to him. And then in the third one, his wife actually arranged the whole thing. She found the diary, and then she gave it to the friend to give to him. And then another variant is that it was all hoaxed and fabricated, and she did it to inspire some type of creative project within him. And you're just hearing all of these different stories, and that sheds a lot of doubt on the diary of Jack the Ripper. But here is one variant of the story that makes the most sense to me. And if you want to challenge me on this, please put your response in the comment section down below, and I would love to read your comments. One thing that I have heard about Michael Barrett is that he wanted to write a book on the Egbert poisoning. He wanted to write a book on the suspicious death of James Maybrick. So he researched the case. And he got to a point where he realized that certain things with James Maybrick seemed to line up with Jack the Ripper. He was in England at the time, and, it's not completely impossible for a 50-year-old man to have done this. And he had researched the case to a point where he thought that he could fabricate certain things that would line up perfectly with the Jack the Ripper story without creating any discrepancies. So it was possible for him to fabricate the Jack the Ripper connections. It was possible for him to fabricate the diary of Jack the Ripper. And that's ultimately the one that I would go with, just being presented with all of these possibilities. Somebody looked into this Victorian story and they learned how to make this passable, well, forgery, this hoax of the diary of Jack the Ripper, which would include things about using certain types of ink, using certain types of paper, trying to make it appear older. And let's say, though, I mean, even if this is James Maybrick's, I don't even want to entertain anything in a hypothetical, actually. I think I've told you guys what I really, really believe most likely happened. And as I understand, this just ruined Michael Barrett's life. This whole plan about coming forward tore his marriage apart, and most likely because he was not telling the truth. And that's where I have to leave that. Now, as far as the involvement of James Maybrick just as a Jack the Ripper suspect outside of the diary, I do remember one thing that was shared in the documentary version of the Diary of Jack the Ripper, and that is that he lived in Liverpool, but he would go to London frequently for medical appointments, and his whereabouts in London were all documented because the medical records still exist, even in the 90s. That's what they shared in the Diary of Jack the Ripper documentary. But in a different Jack the Ripper documentary, which I can't recall off the top of my head, they stated that that was something that was only assumed to have been true, that he was definitely in England at the time, but they were just making the assumption that he had visited England for medical appointments. I haven't verified the records firsthand, so I think at this point, for the purpose of this discussion, that's almost a back burner issue because of all the reasons that I've just laid out. But what do you think about this concept of James Maybrick being Jack the Ripper? Do you think 50 years old is too old to be Jack the Ripper? I don't. What do you think about this thing about how he had the disastrous marriage, so he wants to act out the fantasy of killing his wife over and over again, and he signed the FM on Mary Kelly's wall for Florence Maybrick? I think that that is borderline ridiculous that somebody would do that. And this is not the only person who is accused, who's been accused of being Jack the Ripper for this exact reason. We have Joseph Barnett, who gets accused of murdering women over and over again to scare Mary Kelly off the streets and to end her days as a prostitute, even though not really on the streets. Mary Kelly had her own room at 13 Miller's Court, but to scare her out of the prostitution world. And then we also have Win Weston Davies accusing Francis Spurzheim Craig of doing almost the exact same thing. And to give a shout out to Jay in the comments section, he said that it's almost like Francis Spurzheim Craig is the poor man's James Maybrick, or I think the exact quote was that the book that was written about him, Jack the Ripper, A True Love Story, is the poor man's Diary of Jack the Ripper, and I mostly agree with that. This whole concept of acting out the fantasy of murdering one's wife or partner over and over again. So I think that these claims are mostly borderline ridiculous. But I also wanted to come back to the James Maybrick case for a very different reason, and that is because, as I said, there are multiple stories that are connected to the Jack the Ripper narrative. And one of them is the Egbert poisoning. And this is something that is very intricate and specific. And when I first heard the stories of James Maybrick 2 years ago, I wouldn't have been able to tell you was Florence Maybrick responsible for his murder or not. Now, I'm going to tell you, I don't believe that she was guilty of this. I think that it was an accident. Because when James Maybrick is in America, you've already heard that he was using arsenic as a medicine. And one thing that has been proposed is that Florence Maybrick knew this, and she heightened the dosage of arsenic, or she gave him what would be an overdose of arsenic, so that he would have passed away, and that she poisoned him with it. But it's also been reported that James Maybrick was someone who self-medicated. He took various types of medications, and he also might have been dealing with internal illnesses that were unrelated to the arsenic. Because even on his own Wikipedia page, it states that the amount of arsenic that was found in his system was considerably less than a lethal dosage. It was almost only 20% of what a lethal dosage would have been. So it could have been a completely unrelated issue that was causing his death in the first place. And he was 50 years old at the time. And yes, people in the 1800s could live a lot longer than 50 years old, but it wasn't uncommon for somebody to pass away from natural causes at the age of 50. I mean, we've also talked about people who, in the Jack the Ripper case or in the Whitechapel murders stories, that passed away from natural causes who were younger than 50 years old. So really, I'm just not seeing any evidence that Florence Maybrick actually murdered her husband. I suppose it's possible, but if I had to put a split on it, I would probably say that there's about an 80% chance that she was innocent, and this was just a complete accident, or it was something that could have been caused by James Maybrick himself abusing his medications, or an unrelated health issue. 20% chance that she is guilty, but that is an overwhelmingly in favor statistic of her being innocent. But that's just my take on the subject. Next question. Do you think that Florence Maybrick was guilty of the Egbert poisoning murder? And I told you guys that I've been trying to make the Ripper Wednesday episodes more dynamic, so I'm going to be incorporating different sources into these Ripper Wednesday discussions. And one book that I actually received as a gift was The Poisoner's Handbook by Deborah Blum, which is going to talk all about how different poisons can be used in homicides. And there is an entire section that is devoted to arsenic and murders that can be committed by arsenic. And this is something that stands out because on Forensic Files, I'm a lifelong viewer of Forensic Files, they talked about how there are two specific types of crimes that create more evidence than when they started, and those are the poisoners and the arsonists, meaning that after someone burns down a building, there are going to be all types of clues that are left behind that will trace back to the arsonist. With poisoning, it's the same thing because the poison stays in somebody's system. And you might be thinking, well, of course, gunshots and knife wounds, those also leave evidence behind, but not to this degree. And even with the Jack the Ripper case, people are still debating about what types of knives were used by Jack the Ripper during the Autumn of Terror, so those results are not in a consensus. Not everyone is in agreement about the blades that the Ripper was using to commit the murders, so I completely agree that poisoning would leave behind more physical evidence. Arsenic was something that was used as a poison very regularly, according to Deborah Blum's book, in the 1800s. And it's really prior to the Autumn of Terror, about the early to mid 1800s, when there were a lot of revolutionary advancements in the physical sciences, particularly in chemistry and the studies of elements. And they were able to isolate arsenic as a specific element, as opposed to differentiating it from arsenic trioxide, which would have 2 arsenic atoms and 3 oxygen atoms. And that would be known as white arsenic as opposed to the grayer, darker type. But with arsenic poisoning, it was even called the poudre de sécession in France. Don't ever make me speak French again. I have a terrible accent. But that would be the powder of secession. And you can interpret that as inheritance powder, meaning that people would poison relatives because they wanted to kill them off and obtain their inheritance, because at the time they didn't have a way to investigate the cases extremely thoroughly. But a lot of that stuff began to change in the 1800s when they were able to learn more about arsenic. And it's not just that the arsenic is in your system and they can identify it. They had to go through very specific measures to find the arsenic in somebody's system. Like, as a layperson, you might think, well, it stays behind after they're dead. Yes, but they had to examine the tissue in a very specific way to identify and locate where the arsenic was and how much arsenic had been put into somebody's system. And one of the stories that is in the Poisoner's Handbook is about how a woman goes to a restaurant in New York City and she's eating a piece of pie. Then all of a sudden she becomes violently ill. She becomes ill to the point where she is just screaming, and they later found that she had been poisoned with arsenic. So they examined the kitchen in the restaurant, and it turned out that there were no traces of arsenic in the raw ingredients like flour and butter and sugar. There was no arsenic there. So that meant that there had to have been some type of manipulation with the arsenic while the pie was being created. And that gives them a clue. That gives them a lead. But can an investigation like that be conducted with Florence Maybrick and James Maybrick? I think absolutely not, because James Maybrick regularly took arsenic as a form of medication. It was medicinal for him, and I don't think anyone's disputing that. He took arsenic, he passed away. The question is, was he overdosed by his wife, or was this just a very terrible tragedy? So these types of investigations and leads really are not very fruitful, and they're also not going toward something that could be extremely beneficial for the purposes of these discussions. And in regards to the death of James Maybrick, there's another line in Deborah Blum's book where it says that in the past, physicians often mistook the poisoning of arsenic for death by natural causes, prior to these discoveries that I've talked about in the 1800s. Well, one thing that I was just thinking about as I was reading this book was, if they can mistake arsenic poisoning for death by natural causes, why couldn't that happen in reverse, where they are mistaking death by natural causes for poisoning by arsenic? And that could be the answer to everything associated with the Maybrick murder, if you want to call it that. Again, I don't really think there was a Maybrick murder. I think that Florence Maybrick was somebody who was perhaps unfairly vilified, 80% chance that she was unfairly vilified, and if there was an actual cause of James Maybrick's death, it would perhaps be more likely that he was taking lots of different pills, substances, and perhaps even poisonous concoctions involving something like arsenic, and it either proved to be an overdose, or it just took its toll on his body over time, and that ultimately led to his death. But I would love to know what you think about the Maybrick murder, and I was really, really curious to look more into this. And that's another motivation for this episode, because one thing that I did tell you guys 2 years ago that I remember very clearly saying was, looking into the story of James Maybrick might not give us a 100% certifiable answer about Jack the Ripper, but I think that we could probably get to the bottom of the Egbert poisoning mystery. We could solve the Maybrick murder, perhaps, and actually find out what really happened back in 1889. But if you guys want to challenge me on any of the comments that I've made about James Maybrick and this story, please put your responses in the comments section down below. And I told you guys that I'm going to discuss some things from the Rippercast, which is a podcast that has been uploaded to YouTube. They have a lot of older episodes. It's almost like a backlog of older Jack the Ripper podcasts have been put on YouTube. And in the most recent one that I was listening to, they were discussing the different types of Jack the Ripper films and which ones are likable, which ones are not likable. And I'm going to be very honest with you guys. I have not seen the movie From Hell with Johnny Depp, and I think that it's not really high on my list. It's not that I don't want to see it, it's just there are other movies that I would rather watch, I would rather use my time to watch than From Hell, because that is a film that came out in the early 2000s. And there's another film that came out in the mid-2000s, in 2007 to be precise, and that is Zodiac by David Fincher. And that film has just become a revolutionary classic in the Zodiac killer case. I mean, people who follow the Zodiac killer mystery are obsessed with David Fincher's Zodiac. But with the From Hell movie with Johnny Depp, that is almost one that has not exactly been forgotten, but it hasn't been thought very highly of. Or when I hear it discussed by people who follow the Jack the Ripper mystery, it's almost in just a passing note where they're just trying to get through the discussion very quickly so they can talk about something else. And as I was listening to the Rippercast, they were very, very critical of certain things, such as saying that, well, you know, the facial hair of the actors wasn't exactly the way that it would have been in Victorian Whitechapel and Victorian England. And they also said that the actresses that were cast for certain roles were also not resembling what women would have looked like on the streets of Whitechapel in 1888. And my response to both of those things is, I completely accept that. I'm sure you're right, but Hollywood's going to do that. Film studios are going to do that. British film studios are going to do that. They're going to try to make people more attractive because they think it looks better on film. And I completely understand the need for historical accuracy, the desire for historical accuracy, but that is going to happen, and I really don't even bat an eyelash when that happens on film. Now, as far as discussing which movies about Jack the Ripper were the best, I mean, for me, I almost have to go with The Lodger from 1927 by Alfred Hitchcock. I just think that he was such a brilliant filmmaker. And if I recall, The Lodger was his third film. It's a silent movie with Ivor Novello. And it tells the story about this man who is living in someone's house. He is the lodger. They're trying to find out, is he the killer or not? But a big thing that they did point out was that this isn't exactly a Jack the Ripper film because he's not called Jack the Ripper. He's actually called the Avenger as opposed to the Ripper. But I think it's just very well done. There's some just brilliant, brilliant scenes, and there's just so many artistic things from Alfred Hitchcock in The Lodger. Plus, I love silent films. I was very surprised that they didn't even once mention the 1959 Jack the Ripper film, and I think that this is one that stands out to me because I was just pleasantly surprised with it. And they alter a lot of things. They change the names of some of the people involved, and it is a spoil to give a spoiler alert. You will know who the killer is by the end of it, so that is also a fictitious and creative liberty where we don't actually know the real identity of Jack the Ripper. But I think that I purely think highly of that film because I thought that it was going to be something extremely silly, and it actually turned out to be not only an entertaining film, but they definitely put a certain amount of time in the production value for a 1959 movie. That's Jack the Ripper, once again from 1959. There were other films that they really didn't talk about too much, and they were like A Study in Terror, where Sherlock Holmes goes up against Jack the Ripper from 1965, and that is one that I also do like, although if we're going to nitpick about things like facial hair and about historical accuracy, that would be one where they definitely had younger women playing the victims of the Whitechapel murderer, and they're even referring to them by name in that film. Like, the woman they had playing Annie Chapman was probably 21 years old or something like that. And they're also very well dressed. The women are very clean and neat, which wouldn't really be things that you would expect from Whitechapel, but particularly the ages. And this is one thing they talked about, like, why doesn't somebody make a Jack the Ripper movie where the women are actually presented with their real ages, as well as finding actresses that can match the illustrations. I repeat, the illustrations and the drawings of them. Annie Chapman was photographed while she was still alive, and there are surviving photographs. But with the other women, we mostly rely on the illustrations, even though there are mortuary photos, and of course the crime scene of Mary Kelly has been photographed, but her facial features are not recognizable in that one. Let's just say that. And I also decided that I was not going to show the crime scene of Mary Kelly, so this episode actually changed that, where I showed the FM for Florence Maybrick, allegedly on the wall. Now, there's also a movie out there called Man in the Attic, which is a variant of The Lodger. And I mean, it's a variant of that story, but I think that I really didn't connect with that film because I had seen The Lodger first from 1927. So when I was watching Man in the Attic, there are certain things, though, that I think it would be almost necessary to watch The Lodger first. So you can have certain surprises that are waiting for you, but at the same time, it's just like it's almost like a less exciting version of that story. And as you can tell, I really don't like to give away too many spoilers, but in a lot of the movies that I have been talking about, they do show you who Jack the Ripper was at the end, and that really isn't the worst thing in the world because it's historical fiction. And that's what I've accepted that these stories are all about, is that they are taking real events and real people, and they are writing fictitious stories about them. Historical fiction. They're not trying to make it appear to be some purely certifiable fact. So changing some things about the ages of the victims or somebody's beard length for a movie, that is also something that I really don't fret too much about. But as far as Jack the Ripper films, I've really found that people talk to me a lot more about the Michael Caine miniseries or episodes that were made back in the 1980s with Michael Caine and Jane Seymour. And I say this because it's just what you guys put in the comments section, or you start talking about how someone has watched that when they were younger, and that's one that really stayed with them. People have also told me that that was the thing that got them pulled into the world of Jack the Ripper, and that I was just really surprised that that one stood out to a lot more people than the movie such as From Hell, but maybe you guys are from a different generation than me. When From Hell came out in 2002 or whenever it was, yeah, there were a lot of conversations about it. There were a lot of discussions about it. But I mean, I think that it's mostly faded away from serious talk on Ripperology. And on the Rippercast, though, they did say some things to the effect of that they thought that the graphic novel of From Hell was so much better because it was actually trying to shed light on certain subjects, and was also trying to highlight certain things that seemed implausible about the Ripper case, whereas the movie was trying to make it seem like this is actually what happened. It's arguing in favor of these events being a plausible historical narrative, whereas one is almost highlighting them because of certain absurdities. And you guys can tell, even though this is just some comments that were made on a podcast, once again, I really don't like to give away too many spoilers. But out of all the cases that I talk about here on Black Box Online Radio, Jack the Ripper definitely has the most fiction that's been created based on the Whitechapel murderer, and even beyond that, the most movies. Because I talk mostly about Jack the Ripper, the Zodiac Killer, and D.B. Cooper. There was a movie made about D.B. Cooper in 1981 called The Pursuit of D.B. Cooper, which is a very, very silly film. It takes place after D.B. Cooper has made his jump from the plane with the $200,000, and it actually starts out with him jumping out of the plane. You don't get to see any of the actions or activities on the plane, which I think a lot of people would have been curious about. That would also be one where, surprisingly, they had an actor like Treat Williams play D.B. Cooper, where he didn't necessarily look like the composite sketches. And maybe I'm being a little bit of a hypocrite there for saying that, oh yeah, they're just going to get people that look better on film, but just pointing it out, I guess that would be one thing. I think that they could have definitely found somebody who resembled the D.B. Cooper sketches more so than Treat Williams. And yeah, it's overall, it's a fairly silly movie. But I think that's because somebody like me who has followed the real stories is kind of just looking for what actually would be something that would help your mind in regards to the D.B. Cooper case, like the way that somebody might watch the From Hell movie with Johnny Depp, and they would be thinking, well, what from this story could actually help your mind? Or how would you want to challenge this compared to what you know about the actual story? And overall, though, I think that you're probably not going to find a lot of that in some of the films that I've just mentioned, but they do make an honest attempt to tell a entertaining story, and that really is the focus of what Hollywood is trying to do, as well as the British film media and independent films. I know that some people care greatly about stories like Jack the Ripper, and they want to incorporate this into a film for a reason, but at the end of the day, something like Hollywood is trying to tell an entertaining story to as many people as possible. That's why they're going to do things like getting younger women to play the victims of Jack the Ripper, or that's why they're going to try to make the male characters look more attractive to female viewers, because they just want to reach a bigger audience. But somebody on the Rippercast brought up this point, and when they said that Hollywood has no respect for the facts or the true stories. And I will challenge that person by saying, you might not be incorrect about that. You might be right about that. But who has a bigger amount of disrespect for the story than Hollywood? How about the tabloid media? And I would love your responses to this one right here. I would put the tabloid media well above Hollywood in terms of showing disrespect for true crime cases. Say, for example, when some type of little tabloid gossip magazine is going to throw around some headline that the Jack the Ripper case has been solved, like they do every 5 to 10 years, and that so-and-so is Jack the Ripper. With the Zodiac world, perhaps it's even worse. When they just sort of start trying to mislead the general public into thinking that this high-profile true crime case has been solved. Why is that more disrespectful? Because when somebody watches the From Hell movie with Johnny Depp, they know that it's historical fiction. Oh, when somebody watches A Study in Terror, where Sherlock Holmes is one of the characters, they know that's historical fiction. But when they're reading something in the news, and these days, I don't know about reading too much, when they're watching the news media, whether it's on their phones, tablets, or the television, then they are going to think that that stuff is real. They're going to think that it's true. They're going to think that Mr. So-and-so who's selling a book, and there's that one guy with a table runner. I don't even want to talk about him anymore because I've just exhausted myself talking about his stories over the last 6 months. When they just say that the Jack the Ripper case has been solved, they are making people actually think something that is untrue. They're not presenting their claims as historical fiction. The tabloid media is genuinely trying to deceive people, and the people who run those publications know that their stuff is inaccurate. They know that they're putting out things that are untrue. All you'd have to say is that the authorities have not signed off on this. The authorities haven't verified this. This is just Mr. So-and-so pushing a book. And, this is not exclusive to the world of Jack the Ripper. With D.B. Cooper, the Zodiac, this stuff happens all the time. The media will zone in on a particular suspect, and then they will be saying, this person was most likely the perpetrator. Sometimes they'll even say that this person has been identified as the perpetrator, and it's all untrue. And they know that it's untrue. They're just trying to create the media firestorms for their own benefit. They're trying to generate some type of buzz and press. And who is the absolute worst? You guys know who was the absolute worst. It's those people who were publishing those rags back in 1888, like the Star and so on. This stuff has gone on for over 100 years, where the media is trying to make people think a certain thing so they can sell newspapers, and then to talk about things on the TV. Now it's to get clicks on YouTube and TikTok. What a wonderful place to get your news now. TikTok. But that exists. And that's the future that we're going to have to deal with. Okay, end rant. Do you agree or disagree with my statement that the tabloid media is more disrespectful to the stories than the acts of Hollywood? I would love to know what you guys think, as well as talking about James Maybrick and the arsenic poisoning history, all of that thing. And do you think that Florence Maybrick was responsible for the murder of her husband? Please put your responses in the comment section down below. I would love to read them. And that will be all for me now. You can write the show at blackboxonlineradio@AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook name is Ned DeHaan. There's also a Black Box Online Radio Facebook page. And you can get the show on TikTok and Instagram at blackboxned88. Hey, if people are putting out their news on TikTok, I might as well join in. Now, I really only use TikTok for uploading the shorts and reels. I don't really watch anything over there. Instagram is being used less and less too by countless other people. But yeah, blackboxned88 over there. And if you want to support all of these efforts, you can go over to buymeacoffee.com. buymeacoffee.com/blackboxned88, and that allows you to make a donation or contribution to help the show. And anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. And that's all for me now. Until next time.